Welcome, everybody, to today's session of the Climate Ambition Accelerator. This is the greenhouse gas emissions practice exercise with WSP. Joining us today are Clara and Jake here on the call. And it will be an interactive session with a lot of exercises based on your homework. If you have any questions, please use the chat so that we can follow up on your questions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to WSP. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Firaz. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good to see you here today. Quick intros from us. I hope you can all see my screen. Shout out if you can't, or give me a nod. I see some nodding, that's good. So I'm Clara Mitchell. I'm a Principal Net Zero Consultant for WSP in the UK. I have background in net zero and decarbonisation, as the title suggests, but I specialise in the energy sector. And yeah, really happy to be here today to hopefully support you all in your journeys. Jake, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Jake Chathui. I work as an environmental consultant at WSP. And in my role, I'm responsible for completing corporate carbon emission inventories for our clients, which is very similar to the exercise we will be going through with you today.
Great. So here is the agenda today. We'll do a bit of an intro like we're doing now. We have a practical exercise to go through. We will look at the solution, how we got there, and just pull out some key points in the example that you can take away and apply to your own emissions and your own carbon inventories. And we'll have time for Q&A. We thought we might do Q&A as we go through, so feel free to shout out, raise your hand if that's an option, or just call out or put in the chat. We just wanted to check, have you all done the pre-work, or are you hoping to go through it today? Have you done it beforehand? Could let me know, that'd be great. I think I see one thumbs up, a couple thumbs up, but I'll take silence as a no. So we've got a couple thumbs up. It seems like the majority have not done it. I see a thumbs down, thank you. Okay. Okay, so what I propose we do then is we just take you through the solution, and we can take it really slow. We can go through exactly how it's all calculated and worked out, and we can take questions as we go. So we'll skip the breakout rooms and we'll kind of go straight into the solution overview, but we'll go through it detailed. So Jake's going to lead this, and as I said, any questions as he's going through, please shout out. He'll stop after each section and give you a few moments for questions. But yeah, please, you know that this is supposed to be interactive, so please use the time to ask your questions. We're here to help. You know, if we can't help you, I'm sure we can. We've got a lot of experience in this, but if we can't get the answer right away, we'll take it away and we can provide that to the group afterwards. But yeah, please use this time to get some support and ask your questions. So I'll hand over to Jake if you want to steal the screen and share the module.
Yes. Hopefully that's come up. All
yep,
good?
I can see that.
Okay, so I'll just quickly go over the task summary again. There was another document which outlined it in a bit more detail. But essentially, we have been tasked to do a carbon footprint exercise for a food and beverage company that packages and distributes roasted coffee beans. They've got an office in Canada, and then they also have a roasting facility in Brazil. These categories down here are the different emission sources for which we have activity data for, and we will be trying to fill in the gaps and get an emissions summary for the scope 1 and 2 and 3 for the 2021 calendar year. The results summary tab will probably leave to the end if not many people have managed to complete it before the start. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through each tab one by one. Please ask questions throughout. I'll try and explain to the best of my ability the exact process used. So natural gas is under scope 1 because it is burnt by the company on site. Other scope 1 categories would also be like diesel for generators, or burning petrol or other types of fuel for company-owned vehicles. But for this exercise, there's only one scope 1 category, which is natural gas. So the Toronto office, they use it for heating and they use it for roasting in the Sao Paulo facility. This is the raw data that we've received from the sites. So there's a few issues with the Toronto office with missing data, whereas the Sao Paulo office, we've got a full set of data. So this Sao Paulo facility is generally what we'd hope to receive. This is sort of ideal data. We've got a monthly breakdown, and that allows us to get an annual total. So I think I'll just go through the process for Sao Paulo first, because it's more simple, and then we'll figure out a way to get some totals for the missing months in Toronto. So down here is the solution section. So the first step is to get a total for the amount of natural gas consumed over the year. It's 535,000 cubic meters of natural gas. We want to convert that activity data into emissions, and to do that, we need to use these emission factors that are provided over here on the right. We've got emission factors for carbon dioxide, for methane, and also for nitrous oxide per unit of activity data, which again is cubic meters. So we will just see how the solution works. So we've got the activity data multiplied by the appropriate emission factor to get a total emissions of that greenhouse gas, that specific greenhouse gas during the reporting period. So that's the one for carbon dioxide. Then we'll see again, it's the quantity multiplied by the emission factor for methane. And then also we've got it for nitrous oxide. Now we put it in the unit of tons, because otherwise if we keep it in kilos, the numbers just get too large. So to convert kilos to tons, you just need to divide by 1,000. And we've done that at this stage, but you could also do it right at the end as well, if that makes it more simple for you. Okay, so we've got the total emissions per greenhouse gas, but the last step is to combine them into a unit called CO2e. So if you're unfamiliar with what CO2e is, it's just a way to combine all the different greenhouse gases and their global warming potentials into one figure, so it's more easy to see the total at first glance. And again, or just in case you're not aware of the term global warming potential, it's just a way to compare the different warming potentials of how effective each greenhouse gas is at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So methane here has got a warming potential of 28. That means that releasing a kilo of methane would have the same amount of warming potential as releasing 28 kilos of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, though it's the most abundant greenhouse gas we have in our atmosphere, luckily it's the least effective at trapping heat. We might be in a lot more trouble if it wasn't. Nitrous oxide has a GWP of 265, and some other greenhouse gases like sulfur hexafluoride, they go into the hundreds and thousands and the tens of thousands. So just one to bear in mind. So we've got the totals for each greenhouse gas. We then just simply need to multiply the greenhouse gas total by the GWP. So we've got the carbon dioxide total multiplied by 1, then we've got the methane total multiplied by 28, and the nitrous oxide total multiplied by 265. And then that gives us a total CO2e value for the Sao Paulo office of 1,043 when you round it up, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's worth noting that in the UK, we're very fortunate to have a good emissions factor database, which is provided by the government each year. And they normally, what they do, they just provide the totals in CO2e, so we don't have to go through the hassle of adding the GWPs and whatnot. But for example, in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency, they provide their values per greenhouse gas. So you would need to go through this process if you had an office there, for example. Okay, so that's the total for Sao Paulo. Hopefully that process has been okay to follow. It's a bit more difficult with Toronto because we're missing some data, for 5 months. So you need to find a way to apply an estimate or assumptions, and there will be a limitation to your inventory. It's better than leaving it blank. So what we recommend doing is providing some averages, and a single average in this case wouldn't be appropriate, and that's because if we look at the consumption in January, March, and November, they're all over 40,000. They're an average of 40 something thousand. But then we compare the average of the summer months, May, June, July, August, and it's well below 1,000. So if we applied a blanket average to all these months, it wouldn't be truly as reflective as we could get it. And so the approach that we would normally take in this situation is we'd look for an average of winter and summer. So winter would go from October to March, and then April to September would be our summer months. So if we just look at the formula for the winter months and how it was arrived at, we just get the average of the 3 that we have data for, and then we do the same for the summer months, average of those 4. And then on the far right, we can see we've got the actual data combined with the average data, and you can see which one's here in bold, and that gives us the estimated total value for the entire office. Whilst it's not perfect, you just need to sort of add it to your assumptions and limitations sections of your inventory, and then it's just something to look to improve in the future to get more accurate data through invoices or meters, whatnot. So then we just go through the same process as we've done before. So we get the total for each greenhouse gas by multiplying the emission factor by the quantity, and then we account for the global warming potential of the different greenhouse gases to get a total of 540. We've got the total, which is the sum of both offices for natural gas, which is 1,583 for the year. This is a more concise summary of the solution. So yeah, we need to make estimates of months of missing data. The quantity in winter is much higher, so it's not appropriate to apply a blanket average. And then we use it to estimate the consumption for each month with missing data, respectively. So hopefully I've explained that clearly. Is there any, I'll pause here just for a sec for any questions related to this tab.
Ja, ik moet dit doen dus. Ik moet dit gaan doen dus.
Okay, I think that was just a bit of background noise, so I'm happy to move on if no one's got a question.
Yeah, sounds like it. That was great. I'll just reiterate about the emissions factors. I believe most people in this call are based in the UK. And so the DSENS emissions factors that you would use for the Scope 1 accounting, they are all in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So like Jake said, it's very easy to just apply that one emissions factor and then divide it by 1,000 to get to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you don't need to do it for each greenhouse gas separately in turn. So yeah, if you're fortunate to have your office in the UK, that's very easy. I think I see one hand. Rachel,
Yes,
do you want to go for it?
Rachel.
Hi there, sorry. Can I just confirm, we as an organisation outsource our greenhouse gas protocol calculations to a third-party organisation. So, but we're doing our SBTI reduction targets in-house, which is why we've come on the Climate Accelerator course. Is this kind of granular level of knowledge regarding the calculations essential for the SBTI reduction target setting if we already outsource the kind of calculations to expert third parties?
So you will I suppose it depends. For SBTI, you will need to have this level of detail. You'll need to know all of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions
Yes.
broken down by emission source. You'll need to know what the impact is, so in tons of carbon dioxide in the base year and in your historic years, and you'll need to know that going forward for SBTI. And it should be verified by a third party, which it sounds like you're doing.
Yes, that's correct. So yes, that's kind of where we've obviously outsourced the calculations, so we get a report for each year based on our emissions, using all these calculations that they've used behind the scenes, and then we're obviously using those validated results to press forward with the SBTI reduction targets. But it was just, is there a need for the person setting the SBTI or the organisation to know kind of the granular details about how the calculations have happened, or if you're using a third party, okay, kind of trust those sources?
Yeah, I think it's important that you understand exactly how it's being calculated, and you need to know it's being calculated in line with best practice. So in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it's obviously in line with SBTI's net zero standard or the corporate standard. But that should all be, if it is a verified, audited third-party assessor you're using, that should all be in the report that you're receiving. I mean, without seeing it, it should be if they're properly verifying and auditing it. But I would say, as you go through the SBTI process, the SBTI themselves will question the data in the verification process. So you as a company needs to understand what your data looks like to be able to answer those questions to SBTI. And then to go forward, you need to know at a granular level where your hotspots are so that you can reduce them in line with the SBTI target. So yeah, absolutely fine that you get someone else to do it. That happens. That's what we do a lot of the time at WSP. So that's fine. But you need to, definitely need to understand the data and understand the nuances.
That's really useful. Thank you for that help.
No problem. Mila?
Hi, Clara. Hi, Jake. I actually would have two questions. So the emission factors that you have provided for this task, are they coming from the GHG protocol or like some other databases? I see that being quite of a challenge, you know, with like where to find the emission factors. Yeah, just like where to locate them and to know like which ones to use for what you have to do. Do you want to tackle that one first and then I go to the second question, or?
Sure, yeah. Jake, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe these are kind of dummy factors. Is that right?
Yeah, I think they're roughly right, but there's no actual source for these ones. But Mila, if it's for the UK, the BEIS has a really comprehensive set of emission factors. It does get harder to find them for other countries sometimes, and that's something we struggle with. But other sources like the International Energy Agency, AIB, the EPA for the USA, they provide not necessarily as comprehensive a list, but they still, if the worst case scenario would be to use an emission factor from a region nearby, or even use the UK one if you had to.
Okay, so it's more like location based or like country based.
Yes.
Yeah, depending on the emission source. So petrol will generally be the same wherever you are, but electricity would vary quite a lot between the regions.
Okay, thank you. And the second one is more for the calculations. So I maybe I didn't follow from the beginning thoroughly, but why are we calculating the nitrous oxide and the CH4 along with the carbon? That's what I didn't get.
Because burning natural gas releases these other greenhouse gases as well. So if we didn't include them, we wouldn't be capturing the full warming potential of that activity. And there are generally 6 greenhouse gases. I think they're in the Kyoto basket, they're called. But these are the 3 main ones, and the most relevant ones.
Yeah, so as we said, Mila, if you're using, if you're burning natural gas in the UK, you'll be using the BEIS or the DSENS emissions factors. and they have one emissions factor that covers all of the greenhouse gases that are being burnt when you combust natural gas. So you don't need to do the separation between carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, or whatever other greenhouse gas you're combusting. But as Jake said, different countries don't have that one emissions factor like we do in the UK. So if you've got offices in America or anywhere else in the world, you may need to break it down or use a proxy factor like the UK one. But this is just a very thorough example to show if you didn't have these very useful emissions factors that just have the one factor for all greenhouse gases, then you would need to break it down like this.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Alexa?
Yeah, I had a question about the third-party verification. I think you mentioned that we have to when we want to submit our goals to SBTi, we need the third party. And now I'm thinking, would that party, like a consulting agency that is helping you, counts as a third party, although you're sort of calculating together the emissions? Or do you actually need still another party to go over your emissions?
Yeah, sorry. For SBTi, you don't necessarily, Jake, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my experience of the SBTi is you don't necessarily need someone to verify your emissions. Might be wrong there, Jake, but it's always helpful because, everyone does things a different way, and if you're in different sectors or different countries, like we say, there's lots of ways to do it. So it's definitely helpful. I'd recommend having your greenhouse gas inventories always verified by an independent third party. That's best practice. But you may need to just check the SBTi guidance again, and we can look afterwards and send that out to you. But the guidance is quite clear around what it needs. I mean, yeah, recommendation is to have your inventories always third party verified, and that needs to be by someone who can specifically do that job. So, for example, at WSP, if we calculate your inventory for you, we wouldn't then verify it because we're not an independent party. It would need to be someone else who is qualified and able to do that independent verification and audit process. We basically you can't have someone auditing and marking your own homework, really. So it would need to be someone separate. Hopefully that kind of answers your question, but yeah, happy to point you to the SBTi guidance.
Yep, thank you very much.
Great. Is there any other questions, or shall we move on to the next tab? Just conscious of time.
There's one question from Planon, Clara. Put it in the chat. It reads, I have a question regarding the emission factors as well. What type of source for emission factors advised for European located countries?
Yeah, Jake, do you want to take that?
Yeah, it depends what the emission source is. Again, like if it's electricity, then it'd be AIB or the International Energy Agency. If it's things that would be fairly standard across all countries, then I'd recommend using the BEIS one. But it's probably worth having a look on the websites of any international companies, countries, see if they got any government factors themselves. Though the UK's we're very lucky to have it because it's quite complete and advanced. It's kind of a fallback, I guess, if you don't have a national specific one.
Yeah, if you have any more specifics, feel free to put it in the chat and we can follow up afterwards. We can send you a couple of links or recommendations that would be, an authoritative factor. Essentially, you want it to be the most authoritative that you can, and if that means you need to use a proxy factor that's maybe from a different country, that could be okay depending on the specifics. So yeah, feel free to add some more specifics and we can follow up after this call.
Okay, I shall move on to the next tab then. Okay, so we're now on to scope 2, which is electricity, the indirect emissions of energy generation, which occurs elsewhere but on your company's behalf. So they use electricity for lighting and equipment, both facilities, and they've received invoices with a monthly breakdown of their total consumption. Now, there's two approaches to calculating emissions from electricity, so I'll just go over them both briefly. The first one's called the location-based approach, and that is the same for every company within a certain geographic boundary. It takes the average of the grid, so just the different emission sources, or the generation sources rather, and how much they contribute to the grid determines how clean the grid is. Everyone takes the same number from that. And then we've got the market-based approach, and this takes into account contractual agreements that you might have with a specific energy supplier. So there's a lot out there at the moment that would say 100% renewable energy. And that basically means that you're purchasing something called energy attribute certificates, EACs. And in North America, they're known as renewable energy certificates, so RECs, you can see here. In Europe, we call them REGOs, renewable energy guarantees of origin. And what that allows you to do under the market-based approach is to just apply that specific emission factor from that company, which will generally lead to lower scope 2 emissions under that approach. If you do not have renewable energy certificates under the market-based approach, then you'll have to take something called the residual mix, which is what's left over after all these other companies have come in and sort of taken out the green energy usually out the grid. So that means you're generally left with the more dirty generation sources, which leads to a higher emission factor generally under the market-based approach. So the market-based essentially reflects any contractual agreements you have with energy suppliers. So for both these offices, we have a full set of data, which is great. So down here, we can just see that the sum of the totals for both. And it's just the same process as before. We don't have to worry about GWP this time because it's all in CO2e, the emission factor. So we just multiply the consumption by the emission factor to get CO2e. You can see here that the unit is in grams of CO2e rather than kilograms. So to get it from grams to tons, you have to divide by 1,000 and then divide by 1,000 again, just to make sure you've got the right units. And then you just do that again for the Sao Paulo office. So under the location-based approach, you just multiply by the grid factor. It's much higher in Sao Paulo. That probably reflects a more fossil fuel-based energy grid. And that leads to a total under the location-based approach of 144 tons of CO2e total for the year. And then we move on to the market-based approach. So the Toronto office has 500,000 kilowatt hours covered by RECs, which means that there's only 262,000 unclaimed or unapplied emission factors for that office remaining. And so what they would have to do is multiply, sorry, wrong one. They'd multiply the leftover consumption by the residual, which you can see is 42. It's higher than the grid again because all the clean energy has been, and then that leads to a slightly higher amount of emissions. But because there's such a low amount of consumption left over, actually just shows 11 tons of CO2e compared to 22 under the location-based approach. So they're benefiting from these renewable energy certificates that they're purchasing. The Sao Paulo office is not, so it's the same amount of consumption. There's no renewable energy certificate, so they have to multiply their entire consumption by the higher residual mix factor, and that leads to a slightly higher emissions total under the market-based approach, so 137 compared to 121. And then you just simply add those both up and you get 149 under the market-based approach. And those would be your two totals for the year. I can see there's a hand up from Rena.
Yeah, I have a question relates to the emission factor for Sao Paulo. So since in the case study it's mentioned that the electricity is being connected with the local grid, so why can't we use grid emission factor in the calculation for, in this case, why residual mixed electricity emission factor we are using here? Because we know it's connected to the local grid.
Well, there's for the market-based approach, I think you're talking about. Yeah, there is a hierarchy of approaches to use, calculation approaches to use under the market-based. So it goes renewable energy certificates and then purchase power agreements. So it's direct agreements with energy suppliers, and then it goes to the residual mix, and then only as a last resort, if there's not a residual mix, you drop to the location-based approach. So it'd be the same as the location-based. But because there's a residual mix factor available, you need to use it.
Yeah, but when it comes to SBTi target reduction, then do you think then what is the right way of measuring the performance, against the location-based or against the market-based? Because how I see market-based, in spite of using RECs, still the combined results is like more greenhouse gas emission.
It depends. For SBTi, it's difficult because you can pick either approach, I believe. And so generally, probably pick the one that's lower for yourselves. If you purchase RECs, then the market base is generally, I think, 90% of companies that purchase RECs use the market-based approach, because they can sort of SBTi allows these to be claimed as valid reductions. Is there parts of that question I didn't quite answer?
My question is, when we define the baseline for a company greenhouse gas emission related to scope 2 emissions, so the baseline should consider location-based scope 2 emission or market-based scope 2 emissions? Because
Sorry, that's again up to yourself. You can pick, but I think if you have anything to add, Clara, please do.
Yeah, so you can kind of choose which one you base your SBTi targets off of, but for reporting, you do need to report both. So you should be reporting both the location-based and the market-based, because there are nuances with both. So bottom line is you can kind of choose either to model your targets off of, but you need to be reporting both.
Okay, thank you.
I think I saw another hand up. So yeah, okay. Chloe, do you have a question?
Yes, hi. Sorry if that has been covered already, but I'm assuming that has to do with the definition of location and market-based, but what exactly does grid electricity emission factor mean versus residual mixed electricity emission factor? So how do you need to use one in the case of market-based and the other in the case of location-based?
There are definitions for all these terms. They're in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I'm sure they're in SBTi as well. If that'd probably be the first port of call. But residual is just what's left over after the contractual agreements of other companies have been taken out.
So at a very high level, you would use the grid electricity factors for your location-based reporting, because these are location-specific grid mixes. So within the UK or within the US or wherever you are, what's the kind of average grid mix with all the generation types, whether it's renewables, gas, coal, that mixed together, apportioned over the year, that's your grid electricity factor for that country or location. And then you use the market-based, you use the residual mix and your renewable electricity certificates or whatever that is. So that might be 0 being your emission factor for however much you're purchasing through renewable energy certificates. You would use the residual mix and the whatever other factor for your certificates or your PPAs as your market-based approach. So your grid is used for the location-based, and the residual and the specific technology-based factors are for your market-based approach, because that's literally what you are purchasing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'll go have a look at the GHG protocol as well. Thanks.
Great. Okay, shall
Shall I
we
answer
move
scope
on?
3? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
go for it.
Okay.
There'll be lots of questions on scope 3.
Oh, there always. Okay, so the greenhouse gas protocol split scope 3 into 15 categories. This tab here covers category 1, which is purchased goods and services, and also category 2, which is capital goods. Getting data for scope 3, especially these two categories, is notoriously hard. So what we quite often end up doing is using spend-based data. The improvement on that would be getting data specifically from your suppliers. That's hard to do. So spend base is what we use a fair amount of the time in our calculations, with a recommendation to sort of engage with these suppliers to see if they can provide more specific values in the future. So you've got these two pieces of, so you've got the grinding machine and then the printing services, and then you've got the spend by them. In the UK, we have spend-based emission factors. Oh, sorry, there's a question. Shall I answer that first, Thomas?
No, please continue. I can answer afterwards.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the UK, again, we're very lucky. We've got spend-based factors, but they're quite broad categories. They're hard to interpret sometimes. So it's still a level of uncertainty with them. And then it's also subjective because we have to categorize these activities that we're provided by our clients into these categories. Okay, so we've got the grinding machine here. We've got a emission factor, which is kilos per US dollar. So the process again is what we've done before. So it's the activity data multiplied by the emission factor, and then that leaves us a total in tons once we've divided it by 1,000 of 1.98 for the year for the grinding machine. And then we just follow the same process again. The printing services, we've got the spend, we've got the emission factor, which is in spend. And so we multiply those two, divide by 1,000, and that leaves us with 1.08. The coffee beans, we're happy because we have got specific data from the farmer. We've got an emission factor per kilo of coffee bean. So the process remains the same, but the quality of data is higher. So we can be more confident that the emissions that we've reported are accurate. You just multiply the quantity by the emission factor, make sure the units are aligned, and then divide by 1,000 again, and that leaves us with a total of 303 tons for that emission source. So in this instance, the capital good, it's used to produce the, sorry, let me know if my connection goes, by the way. Just got
You dropped for a few seconds. Maybe just start again from this section.
Yeah, apologies for that. So the grinding machine is a capital good because it's used to produce the goods that they sell. So that'll go in the category 2, and then in the category 1, printing services, obviously a service, and then the coffee beans is the good. So you'd combine those two to get a total for scope 3 category 1, and then the 1.98 is for scope 3 category 2. Hope that's made sense. I'll pause here quickly to see if there's any questions related to these categories or these calculations. Yes, Thomas, sorry.
Yes, hi. Just one question on the spend-based method for category 4. If we apply spend-based method for purchase goods and services, what is the way to reduce the emissions from this category? The only way then is to buy less, right?
Yeah,
which is not good for manufacturing companies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. Do you want to have a stab at answering, Clara?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I mean, at a very high level, if you're using spend as your kind of activity data, then yes, really the only way to reduce is by buying less, which you say is not a reality for most companies. Most companies are growing. So really what you want to be doing is like Jake said, there's a hierarchy with this. So using spend data is at the bottom of the hierarchy for scope 3 reporting and accounting, because it's very broad. It's not usually reflective. There's a lot of conservatism built in as well to the emissions factors. So you're usually overestimating your impact. And what you want to do is you want to move up the hierarchy to more accurate methods of accounting. So you want to be really getting actual data from your suppliers. So for those grinding machines, what's the carbon impact of those machines? You want your suppliers to be working that out and providing you with that data, so that instead of using the spend data, you can then use proper activity data like they've done for the coffee beans. Now that means that you get to make more informed decisions as a company. You can use your purchasing power to buy less carbon intensive goods. So I mean, this is a very niche example, but a grinding machine, possibly there's a couple of options on the market within your location. You might choose one that has less of a carbon impact. Maybe it's more expensive, maybe it's cheaper, whatever. You've got that purchasing power. So yes, on the face of it, when you're using spend-based data, the kind of option is to buy less. But as you move up that accounting hierarchy to the more accurate methods and gain supplier data, then really it's you using your purchasing power to purchase lower carbon or more sustainable goods. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Chloe, go for it.
Hi, yes, I've got two questions. One not specifically related to this part here, but just overall. Is that possible for you guys to share a list or say where we can find a list of the conversion factors databases, but based on what they are and which countries? So for example, where can we find one for electricity in the UK? Oh, there's A and B. For natural gas in China, there's C and D. Does such a list of reference, let's say, exist, and would you be able to share that?
Jake, you may know, I don't think there's actually a list for every country and every emissions source. I don't think that exists. I think what you rely on is people's knowledge and kind of best practice, possibly. We can provide you with a couple that kind of come to mind. But yes, that would possibly take some time, I suspect.
So it's not something that is easily and readily available out there, no?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, great. The second question I had, so I see, you know, in where was this? In for the natural gas and business travel tabs, we are calculating methane and nitrous oxide as well as CO2, right? How do we know for which activities we have to calculate other greenhouse gases than CO2? So why did we do it for business travel and natural gas, but not say for I don't know, electricity? And why did we not do, for example, HFCs and only just methane and nitrous oxide?
Jake, do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's because not all activities release HFCs, so CO2.
Right, so how do we know which activities release HFCs, methane, nitrous oxide? You know, like how do we know that we need to do it for this activity and not for that one?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. As a rule of thumb, CO2e will be the units provided everywhere, so like bays, and that will do it all for you. If it's not, then I would recommend using just carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide like we've done here. That will cover almost all of the emissions released from an activity. Except for in the cases of F gases, so that would be to do with like air conditioning, air handling units, but that will give you a specific F gas and then the quantity, and then you have to find the emission factor for that specific F gas because they're just so much higher than the values for for the three we've gone through.
Yeah, so I understand the difference between, you know, CO2 emissions and CO2 emissions equivalents. What I'm saying is that I don't know in which case under CO2 equivalents come 1, 2, or 3 of the greenhouse gases. How can I know that in one case? Am I sorry? Maybe I'm expressing myself wrong, but you know, I just don't know. Like, okay, how did I know that in natural gas there was methane and nitrous oxide and not another one? Then that then would make up your total CO2 equivalent.
I think the best practice is to take the units that it gives you. So if it says E, you just have to make the assumption that it's encompassed all of the greenhouse gases. If it's just CO2 specific, then that would suggest that it's not, and you'd have to probably think about doing the global warming potential calculations and adding we did earlier.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, Chloe, it's possible that it comes from expertise in the area, so you understand you know, exactly with, you know, air travel or natural gas or F gases, you kind of know from experience.
Yes.
So I mean, I suppose the quiet recommendation is, if you don't have the time to do lots of Googling and do lots of research to try and understand it, then it's engage with you know, experts in the field. So yeah, without naming anybody, but in particular.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But if I want to do this exercise for my company now, let's say for business travel and natural gas, is it fair to say, okay, I know I also need to multiply my activity data by the conversion factors for those two other gases, and then use the equivalents? So do I know that for these two activities specifically in real life, I actually need to do those 3 gases?
Only if, as Jake said, you know, I guess it's hard for us to answer the question unless we know exactly where these things are taking place. So if Chloe, your natural gas is in offices in the UK, you don't need to worry about it, because the UK emissions factors are all in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, as Jake said. So they've got the E at the end, which means it's encompassing all of the greenhouse gases. You don't need to do the separate stuff. But if it's anywhere else in the world, you would need to see what the emissions factors look like for that region, and then you would need to make a call. And it should be clear enough, because in the emissions factors, you know, spreadsheet or book or whatever it looks like, it should tell you, if it's got the E, if it's carbon dioxide equivalent, then you know that it's encompassing everything. If it doesn't, and it's got factors for each separate greenhouse gas, then you should be including them all. So yeah, without knowing exactly where you're based and what your emission sources are, it's hard to say. But I'd say look at the emissions factors for your region. If it's got the E, use that one. If not, then you'll need to make a call.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's 2 tabs left, and so we've only got 10 minutes, so I'll try and move on to the business travel one. So this is a fairly staple scope 3 category that we calculate quite a lot of the time. This one is data for just 2 flights specifically. We have to do an extra step in here compared to what you might have to do if you use the Bayes factors, because we need to convert into miles, but Bayes provides a factor for kilometers and miles. Just be aware of that. Okay, so we've got the distance per leg in kilometers, and then we've got the flight haul length, and then it's the definition of each length, and then we need to know that because the emission factors vary between the different flight hauls. So this table down here explains what's done. So we just take the kilometer length, multiply it by the mile factor to get it into miles, and then from that we can see it falls under the long haul flight length category, and then we do that for all 4 of the legs that we've got. So this one falls under medium, then we've got another medium, and then we've got another long. So then we would look at summing all of the miles traveled by haul type, so 630 by medium haul, and then around 9,000 by long haul. And then it's just, again, the same process we've got before. So we haven't got the value in CO2e. So we'd need to do it by each greenhouse gas specifically. We'd multiply the distance by the emission factor, which is up here, and then divide by 1,000 to get into tons. And we do that for CO2, we do that for methane, we do that for nitrous oxide, and then we just account for the different global warming potentials by multiplying and then adding them all together at the end to get a total of 2.8 for flights, all the flights undertaken in the year. So this is just a quick overview of the solution. So they're providing kilometers. We need to switch it to miles. Then we look at the miles, the haul types, and then we classify them based on that, apply the correct emission factor, and then we add in the global warming potentials divided by 1,000 to get it into tons of CO2e. I know I rushed through that. Hopefully that makes sense. I can pause here just quickly if there's any questions related to business travel, because I know it's quite a big category. Okay, unless there's something in the chat, then I'm going to move on to the final source, which is waste. Okay, so one of the scope 3 categories looks at how the end of life treatment happens for the sold products. So we look at, we've got some information here. We've got 500,000 coffee bags sold, and then some more information. So we know that the coffee grinds are sent to landfill, or they're assumed to be because we don't have actual data, and all the paper bags are sent to recycling facilities. And then we've got the emission factors by waste type and also the disposal method. So the first step is to get the total mass of each waste stream. So we look at the mass per bag and then multiply by the number of bags. So that leaves us with 1,500 kilos, and then obviously divide by 1,000, sorry, to get into the units we're looking for, which matches the emission factor units. And then we have 225,000 kilos of coffee grinds. And then the last step is just to multiply the mass by the appropriate emission factor. And so I'll just go to the tab. We can see that that's been conducted here, and that gives you the total in CO2e, because hopefully this time they've been provided in CO2e, the emission factors. I think one thing that's worth mentioning or calling out here is that you can see the emission factor for landfill is significantly higher than recycling, especially because it's organic waste. When it breaks down, it produces methane, which has a much higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So that's the carbon aspect of it is another reason why we strongly recommend avoiding landfill as much as possible. And then you just combine those two together. So it's basically all just from the coffee grinds to a total of 1,305 tons of CO2e. Again, I know I've blitzed through that. So if there's any questions, please ask, or I will just quickly go to the summary tab to give an overview of everything we've just gone through. Okay, in case you did have a chance to do it before then, these are the totals to just sort of give an overview of what we've gone through today then. The emissions are the same for every source except for scope 2, where you've got the market-based and the location-based approach. In this instance, there is not much of a difference, but if, for example, 100% of the energy was procured by renewable sources, which is what happens a fair amount of times with our clients, then it would lead to a big difference between the two numbers. So that's just something to be aware of. But the totals are around 3,341 and 46 respectively. Okay, are there any questions about anything I've just gone through in the last 5 minutes or so? Or anything in general from the session? Yeah, I think Thomas, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, just one, because as market base mostly consider renewable electricity. So usually zero emissions. So why in this case you have more emissions in market-based than in location-based?
It's a good question.
Yeah, go on, Clara.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, great question. I always think this as well. Yeah, it's because, as you say, you're using renewable energy for some of your, well, in this case, for some of the Scope 2 emissions, but the residual mix factor that you have to apply to the rest of the emissions is much higher, because that residual mix factor takes out all of the renewable generation from the region, and you're left with the non-renewable generation. So what you're applying can sometimes be higher than the grid electricity factor. So it's something to bear in mind. You know, ideally you're procuring renewable electricity for all of your electricity needs.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if you do procure renewable energy, your market-based will almost certainly be lower than location-based. But if you don't, then you get caught up with the leftover residual mix factor, and that's why it's higher in this instance, because they haven't procured any for the Sao Paulo office and only limited quantity for the Canada office.
Yeah.
Okay, clear, thanks.
Chloe, I can see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick one. So you guys do this like all the time. I was wondering, with the exception that I'm assuming, of course, there are much more normally Scope 3 categories in that, but other than that, is this, would you say, like a fair representation of how this exercise should be done? Again, assuming there'll be more categories under Scope 3, like employee commute and transport, but other than that, would you say this is a fair representation of the exercise overall?
I think that the number of emission sources included is generally lower than the amount we'd be normally doing, and also just, for example, the business travel had 2 flights in it, but we might get data which has hundreds of flights, and then also car, taxis, whatnot, all these different business travel sources. So this is a fair representation of the work we do. It's just the scale and complexity is probably a little bit lower.
But the method of calculation is the same. Like we've said before, the emissions factors could look different, but the kind of theory behind it all is similar. You need the activity quantity or numbers, and you need the emissions factors, and combining those gives you your tons of carbon dioxide equivalent.
Great, thanks. And another one, just for my own curiosity, you just mentioned that organic waste going to landfill, because it releases methane, if I understood correctly, has obviously a really high impact. I was wondering, how does that compare to having well, general waste well, going through combustion, which I believe is the other big way to get rid of waste? Am I even correct in saying that? I don't know, but I was assuming there would be landfill or incineration is the word I was looking for. And how do these two compare against one another in terms of how much they're releasing?
I can answer that if you'd like.
Yeah,
Clara.
go for it.
Yeah, so generally general waste is incinerated to recover the energy from it. The emission factor associated with that is a lot lower than landfill. But I'd encourage you to look at the Bayes factors, because they give a factor for each waste stream and also each waste disposal method as well. So it's easier to see the different emissions arising from different treatment methods.
Okay. And if we don't know where our waste ends up, are we just being conservative and going for the worst case scenario and picking the worst conversion factor?
Yeah, definitely. I'd maybe recommend, assuming
Depends what the waste stream
landfill.
is, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. If it's hazardous waste, that would be combusted. But yeah,
I'm thinking general waste, you know, office general waste.
Yeah, I'd assume it'd be landfill. Jake, do you agree?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say to that is landfill is a lot less common than it was. So, but I think the next course of action is to speak to your waste contractor as soon as possible to get an accurate understanding of what's happened to your waste.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much. We'll share some information afterwards, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, Clara and Jake.
Thanks,
Yeah, thank you
Raz.
very much.
Thanks everyone
Cheers.
for joining.